Thank you very much, and glad to be here. It's great to be to meet a few people and come and be able to present something. It's interesting that I've got eyesight problems here, but I think better with glasses than without.
The light behind you is more.
Sure. It works well with what Eric was saying last night in particular. I think this isn't working. That's all right. Never mind. Because I'm jumping in some of to sort of fine tune some of the things he was talking about last night. As Tom was saying, one of my main interests is what we call cultural apologetics, which is sort of a mouthful, but all it means really is that we're made in the image of God, we're living in God's world. Those who are also made in God's image and are living in God's world, but who do not believe in God, create and deny God, the reality pushes back on them. They run into friction and difficulty in the world that they think there's no God in, when there really is God in it, both in their own nature, in other people's nature, in the, thank you, that's helpful, in society around us and so on. So if you don't believe in God, you're gonna have pushback from the whole world around you, or your own nature, other people, and so on. What the cultural apologetics is doing is let's look at where some of this friction is happening, some of this pushback that non-Christians are actually experiencing. And how can we name it for them so that they can see, rather than just being frustration, contradiction, or whatever, they can see, hey, I'm fighting God. I'm fighting the reality of God in the world. And I could stop doing that at any time I wanted to. So that's the cultural apologetics is kind of trying to do that. Listen to the culture, see where someone who believes that, where are they in tension with God, and what can we do to speak to them? How can we get through to them? How can we make some sort of an impact? Now, I'm going to just spring off at a fair level of, I think, political unrest in America at the moment, and frustration in the political situation, and lots of people saying, I've never seen so many books on democracy is under threat. Will democracy live? Kind of thing. I've been in the last couple of years. And that's not an accident, because there's a lot going on. And a sense that we've lost the story, what is going on. Sometimes I think Christians involved in politics have lost the story too. But where do we turn? And I'm just going to take I'm not going to try and get at the whole story, but just take one piece of the Declaration of Independence and turn that over in my mind and in your minds a bit today, and look at what does it say about who we are. And it's just the second paragraph of the Declaration. Now my thing is quitting. You think it's not going to work? Oh, come on. Wait a minute. Excuse me.
There's Jordan.
He got it from me.
There.
Okay.
Something.
All right. Well, let's try one more. That's my outline that I'll come back to. But that's the paragraph that I want to talk about. Not a strange piece of literature to any of you. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. I want to talk first about what does that mean, and then what does it come to mean? What did it mean when it was written, and what does it come to mean today? Because it's, I think, enormously under threat. Background for this. Ultimately, the ideas that make this possible, particularly all men created equal, endowed by their Creator with rights, come from the book of Genesis, from Genesis 1:26, following the creation of humanity in God's image, in the image of God, the likeness of God, fearfully and wonderfully made, by a God who cares about them, cares about their life, and the full expression of their humanness, which is why he wants them to have these rights in a political setting. If you think of where this gets philosophical, but not in a technical way at all, where are we placed in the world, in the universe? The idea of being in the image of God places us, differentiates us down and differentiates us upward. We are different from the animal world, where they are not made in the image of God. We have a qualitative difference between us and animals because of being made in God's image. You don't have to worry about being the same as a monkey or a squirrel or something like this, or having an equal status. We are in God's image and we're different. So we're differentiated downward. We're not a subhuman. We're differentiated upward also. Shirley MacLaine thought she was God. She is not God. No people can be God. So we're only creatures of God, made in God's image, but we're not gods. So we have a place where we know what's above us and we know what's below us. And which, if you subtract God, you lose that. You lose both going downward and going upward. You have to guess where we are. Are we different from animals? Or is there anything higher than we are? Are we the same as something higher or whatever, or not? That's an important issue. But the issue I'm trying to get at is this idea of being created equal. First of all, having value as God's image, and being created with intrinsic dignity and value. That's a big point. It's intrinsic dignity, meaning our dignity is not conferred on us by the government, by the state. It's not conferred on us by any social institution. The membership in a family doesn't confer dignity on you, although it certainly has in world history, in other political arrangements. Aristocracies, who were people who were important because of whose family they were. Your race doesn't establish your dignity. Your caste or your social class, anything like this. Whether you're in Who's Who or somebody's Hall of Fame, doesn't make any difference. It doesn't make any difference even if you're not in People magazine. It's an intrinsic dignity that is yours because you're you. It's because you matter and are precious to God because of who you are by creation. If you look around this room, you'll see other people who are made in the image of God. In this sense, as much as you are. No one in this room is any more than the image of God than anybody else in this room. In the sense that I'm talking about. The Bible uses another sense, which is a different ballgame, but that's important to see. The thing here is that if that's true, that our dignity is intrinsic to us in that way, it also follows, the thing that Jefferson says here, is that means we're equal to each other, because it's a shared dignity. Equal dignity and value with each other. This is a universal dignity. Every human being has it. In spite of and beneath, this is important, all the observable inequalities there are between us. Okay? If we look at each other and evaluate each other, try to understand each other, you'll see we're unequal in all kinds of ways with each other in things that you can observe. This is because all people are equal in what we possess as having the fingerprints of God on us and the valuation of God over us by creation. To realize how radical this is, you need to realize there's no observable way we can measure people that will add up to us being equal. If you look at what we can observe, discover, find out, you can never establish equality between people. You'll see people around this room, again, look around the room different, again, at whoever shares this room here with you, and they'll be different. People are different from you. They'll be different in health, education, leadership ability, moral stature, wealth, prestige, creativity, initiative, height, weight, sense of humor, how fast you can run, whether you can play the violin, how short your fuse is when you're getting angry, and so on. You can go. We're different all over the place in so many different things. The biblical claim, and this is where you realize how radical the biblical claim is, And he was right last night saying no one thought up of making a government like this because no one had. The radical claim is that despite all the measurable differences, we're equal in our intrinsic mattering to God. In our mattering to God, we're equal. And the question is, how in the world did such a counter to observation idea ever get started? There was the equality. If there's an equality there, it didn't get to anybody by watching each other, or looking at each other, or keeping track of each other at all. So how did it happen? So it's not based in empirical science or anything like that. How did it get started? Well, as I said, it got started from the book of Genesis. It got started only because people have believed the Bible and said, here it is. We're made in God's image. He values us. And we all share that. And that is a vitally important thing. It's in the first chapter of the Bible, and it's carried on. The value of every human being is carried on right straight through the rest of the Scripture. Now, in our history, I'm going to see if I can make this thing work now. Going back to this, down to C in the first category here. Our founding fathers were motivated by this deeply biblical idea. Many of them were Christians. Many of them also were children of what we've called the Enlightenment, which is another very wide philosophical set of ideas and practices in the 17th century. Not entirely against Christianity, but wanting to say we can have what Christians have, but we don't need the Bible to tell us about it. We can, with our own wisdom, with our own experience, we can figure these things out and do a better job without all the truck of the Bible and the priesthood and all this stuff. So it's an attempt to be independent of the Christian faith, but in doing that, they grabbed along a lot of the values coming out of the Bible. They didn't really reject the content of the Bible. They too believed in the equal dignity of all people. Though they thought they could derive it from their own wisdom, they didn't need the Bible to tell them that. So you have the early convention in Philadelphia, as they met together, a bunch of Christians, a bunch of deists, which would be children of the Enlightenment, and they differed on all sorts of things, but they could agree that people were created equal, and that we wanted their equality to be a central part of the government. So different philosophical perspectives, but they shared and agreed on this in tricky ways, as we will know. Jefferson, who wrote the Declaration in early February of 1776, had special help from John Adams and Ben Franklin in putting it together, and then they presented it to the whole Continental Congress in June of that year for further editorial tinkering. And they lopped out a lot of what Jefferson wrote. Jefferson's original document is much longer. He, in fact, has a whole big, long paragraph blaming George III for slavery. Don't ask me how he reasoned that, but the rest, nobody thought that's worth having in here. He had lots of complaints about George III in here without having to blame him for slavery. But they all were able to agree over the paragraph that I've showed you. The very first paragraph is saying why we're bothering to do this at all. The second paragraph that I showed you is showing a radical theological base for the government we are trying to form. Both why we're having a revolution and what we're aiming at in forming it. And it's connected to God, as you can see. It created our equality. He holds these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Jefferson writes this with gravity and simplicity that are as a tiny piece of literature, and it's echoed around the world and been picked up by countless people. Later, as president, Jefferson wrote a famous letter to the Baptist church in Danbury, Connecticut. This is before Eric Metaxas was born there. But it was a Baptist church that had a political wrangle going on, and in the letter that Jefferson wrote as president to respond to that, he described that we need a wall separating church and state. That's where that phrase comes from, the letter to the Danbury Baptists. So it wasn't a legal document at all, but it was just his reflection, and people thought it was a good idea, so they picked it up and have been running with it ever since. But that, there he's saying, as he explained, basically just what the First Amendment says, that we're not going to have a national church, we're not going to have a federal church. There's no American church. It's a Church of the United States of America that is the one denomination that's our national denomination. That's what the First Amendment excludes. It's not going to establish any religion. And that's what he meant by a wall between church and state. But he didn't say anything, and nor does the Declaration, about any separation between God and state. Because God and state are right there in the Declaration, are inseparable in the Declaration. You can't take the God out of it and still have equality, or dignity, or people being, having it necessary to give them rights, especially those rights. So there's no separating walls at all between God and the state in the Declaration. Again, he began not with all the grievances against George III, but with a theologically based foundation for human equality and dignity and rights. For example, coming from this was that this country that they would form, they hadn't worked out diddly about it yet. They hadn't even thought of a constitution. Everything's way ahead of them, but they have ideas and they have tremendously powerful convictions. But that's why the equality means we're not going to have nobility. We're not going to have lords and ladies in America. People are not going to be knighted in America and have lords and ladies here. We're not going to have an inherited power structure, kings and queens. People would not be born with predetermined status, but they were created equal. Endowed by their creator with equal rights for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. You see, right there's the exclusion of monarchy, exclusion of aristocracy. We're going to have people starting in the same place at birth. And this had never been done before. This had never been tried before. Eric was absolutely right when he said this is a unique experiment, unique in all sorts of ways. But it was all, what I'm trying to argue, it was all anchored in the Creator God. It makes no sense, will not hold together without this Creator God underwriting its truth. Then, as the 19th century and the 20th century go on, I think the thinking of the Enlightenment gained ground. A popular sense that we're coming of age, we're growing up, we know a lot more than we used to know, we're very wise, we've learned all sorts of skills and all sorts of things. We don't really need to lean on the Judeo-Christian God the way they did in the beginning. We can know these things without having to the Bible becomes, rather than a lifeline, the Bible becomes an umbilical cord that we can cut, get rid of it, and be better off free from it, because we can go on our own. We can walk free on our own. That's all an unnecessary and expendable commitment in the modern world. As a result, many scholars then and since then, more recently than that, look back, and this is, I'm talking about now, look back at the language of the Declaration of Independence that I've just been talking about, and see the necessary presence of the Creator God as an embarrassment. We're embarrassed by the fact that these words are there, a Creator God. And sometimes, I read quite a lot on the Declaration, and you see very learned scholars write and almost ignore, and some actually do ignore those phrases that having to do with the Creator God. It's just not there. They go on and talk about rights, they talk about equality, but not anything to do with that equality depending on a Creator God. And this is a problem, and I think is a seismic shift when we remove God from this picture, because it makes what I've called an ironic twist. Because it's an awkward situation if your most precious political values come from something that embarrasses you. The equality and the basicness of human rights were expressed as being dependent on God that we have now outgrown, and we no longer really believe in him because we're now a pluralistic society. You see what I'm saying? And it's an occasion for embarrassment with the theological connection of this paragraph. It's not wanting to need God as a foundation for our favorite and most basic political convictions. And there's deep irony in this development. Much of our society has brushed it aside, or brushed God aside, and it sometimes aggressively rejected the God people used to believe in public space, but very much wants to be guided by the high human status that being made in the image of God gives us. They liked the high human status, the rights, the privileges, the equality. They like all that. They want all that. You talk to liberal, almost anybody today wants to hold on to that. We want rights for everybody. We want equality for everybody. But we don't want this God around. And we're embarrassed that it depends in the declaration on God, so we'll minimize it. So we want to have confidence in the qualitative difference between a human being and the animal world, or at least a lot of us do. Animal rights people don't always. But most people really want to say there's a difference between me and a monkey, between you and a dog or a cat or whatever like that. And that difference really, in no time, comes down to very, very life and death situations if we don't really believe it. And I think this is so deep in the American psyche. Almost everybody wants this equality. I think, you think of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. He described the country as dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. That's Lincoln. The front pediment on the Supreme Court building says equal justice under law. Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation says dedicated to the belief that all have equal value. I'm trying to say this idea of human equality is just everywhere to anybody who's thinking at all about the quality of American life. Strangely, what I've described is that it's easier to throw God out than to throw the high human status out that being in God's image gives you. We want to throw God out, but we don't want to let go of the distinctive human status. But without God, what becomes of God's image? I mean, that's the big question, and that's the rub. That's the pushback to someone who isn't a Christian, who doesn't believe in this God being there. That's the pushback. Is that what do you do with truths that rest on being the image of God? And how do we hold it together? That's why as I had in the blurb that they published here, it reminds me of Alice in Wonderland. If you know the story of Alice in Wonderland, there's down in this underground reality, which is almost as if he was on acid. I don't know why. He wrote this, and it's something else again. Amazing to give children. Anyway, the Cheshire Cat down in this underground, who grinned, this great big huge Cheshire Cat. He grinned, and it says his grin remained after the cat had departed. So the cat leaves, but the grin of the cat remains. Now that's, to me, the image to hold in your minds for what I'm trying to talk about. The grin remains, the cat's gone. Or it says, actually, literally, Alice in Wonderland, the grin remained for some time. So the grin wasn't eternal, but disappeared. So I'll refer to this as the Cheshire Cat problem of an image without a creator. We're talking about the very response. What society has done is to let go of God, but keep intrinsic value and dignity of each individual, which somehow they possess along with these extraordinary rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We want the dignity and significance which comes from being in God's image in this world without God himself. Eric was quoting Os Guinness, who's a friend of ours as well. He, in some of his books, talks about ours is a cut flower society. A cut flower society. Cut flowers remain beautiful for a while, but not forever, not for very long. They dry out, they rot, they wilt, and get shriveled because they're no longer connected to their roots. Or the philosopher Richard Rorty called this about himself doing it. He's not a theist at all, but he says this is freeloading off God. And he admitted to being guilty of this himself. I'm freeloading off God. When he wanted ideas that were necessary for him, but he didn't believe in the God who made those ideas possible. That's a very graphic image, freeloading off God. There's people are doing that constantly all around us without knowing what they're really doing. Again, this is the grin of the Cheshire Cat remaining for a while after his departure. Now, I'm going to go and look at a couple of prophets, not Christian prophets like we talk about here, but secular prophets who are speaking very sharply into our world. I disagree with them, both of them, deeply, but I want you to, part of the idea is we're getting to listen to what the non-Christian world is saying, and let's understand it, that we'd be able to speak better to it. This guy, first I'll talk about is Yuval Noah Harari, Israeli historian, who's recently become sort of an intellectual rock star. Anyone ever heard of him? Noah Yuval Harari. He's got a book called *Sapiens*, which has been on the New York Times bestseller list for about a year and a half, which is amazing to stay on there that long. He was off for a few weeks and it's back on again. And he is a fascinating guy. Again, don't agree with him on much of anything, but except that he's really, his interesting things are interesting to me too. But he has a different take on the Cheshire Cat problem. He wants to stuff it into our face, in a sense, this problem. He wants us to really grip it with it, and he thinks no one takes it seriously enough or realizes it. First of all, he starts out with one of the distinctive abilities of a human being is to have imaginations which can invent myths, illusions, and fictions which are sufficiently shared by large numbers of society that they cooperate with the illusion. Okay? We can invent illusions and myths and so on and sell them, in quotes, to people enough so that we all cooperate. The first example he gives, which is a brilliant one, is the value of money. For some strange reason, little colored bits of paper with numbers on them can get you all kinds of stuff. Property, education, houses, meals, just about military, anything you can buy almost with money. And it only works because everybody believes it. Everybody accepts it. And even little electronic blips flying at the speed of light around, not even pieces of paper, not even solid like a piece of paper, but electronic blips flying around the world at the speed of light can buy you nations, hundreds of acres of land, and so on. Things that are concrete, things that are solid. And so he says, and it all works only because people trust the fiction, that money has value. He then goes on to say, God and moral values are the same kind of fiction. God is exactly that kind of fiction, as are all universal moral values. They function to hold life together, and he says, I'm glad for them, because I think I live in a better world because of it, because they're there, and these illusions are there. But they're not, they are fictions. So supposedly, the universal principle about, for example, human equality, and he has a special, his sights, his gun sights are set on this, on the very thing I've been talking about, on the equality of all people, is also just a fiction. When you strip away the shared illusions, what do you have left? You have left biology. Biology doesn't supply you with illusions. Biology brings you down to earth, and you're grounded there, and you can live there because it's objective and it's without fiction. So he sees special vulnerability, as I said, in this notion of human equality. To illustrate it, he makes a retranslation of this second paragraph of the Declaration into biological. we could translate it from English to German or something. He translated it from theological language into biological. Again, in order to sense rub your nose in the Cheshire Cat problem. So he's taking statements that are philosophical and theological assertions about what exists and what people's rights are, and translates them into biology. So he starts, I'll give you a sort of summary of his argument here. He starts out saying, biology says nothing of creation or a creator. People are not created, but evolved. And evolution does not produce equality, but difference, which is perfectly right. The only reason evolution works at all, or in the theory of natural selection, is difference between everybody, and the differences work out and create evolution. He writes, the idea of equality is inextricably intertwined with the idea of creation. The Americans got the idea of equality from Christianity. However, if we do not believe in the Christian myths about God, creation, and souls, what does it mean that all people are equal? And it means absolutely nothing. That's what he's saying. Because biology recognizes no creator, people are not endowed with anything either. So you lose the word endowed. They are just born. They're not endowed, they're born. Also, there are no such things as rights in biology. Birds don't fly because they have a right to fly. They fly because they have wings, he says, which I think is sort of an interesting observation. And so inalienable rights is translated mutable characteristics. That's quite a shift. Inalienable rights to mutable characteristics. In biology, this is him still, this is not me. There is life, but there's no such thing as liberty in biology. And happiness is hard enough to define, so it can't easily be measured, and so is best translated as just the pursuit of pleasure. So I'll give you his full translation here, if I can make this thing work. This is the founders, that I've held before. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, they are endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. For him, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men evolved differently, that they are born with certain mutable characteristics, and that among these are life and the pursuit of pleasure. Now, that's pretty different. That's pretty different. I would suggest that the second version would never have started a revolution. This is a totally flat-footed Darwinism with no moral implications even. There's no obligations that are even implied there. It's just flat-footed, factual statement of a version of how things happened. What he's trying to show is that you remove the theological references and you remove the whole function of it working as it's meant to work. All its ethical claims, rights, and obligations are just poof, gone. And he wants us to recognize that. He wants us to see it. And like I said, he wants to stuff your face in it and have you realize it all rests on God. He then has the nerve to say, well, this is done this way. We need to invent a different basis for human dignity and equality. We need to come up with a different basis for it. And then goes on, as if,
Solve the problem.
as if that was possible. As if, where in the world do you come up with anything that justifies through which you can see all people to be equal and have that really a trusted value. Okay. Another prophet.
May I just ask why the word prophet? I don't understand that.
Oh, someone who speaks very powerfully with a prophetic voice, who's taken as a prophet by society.
Okay.
So I don't see him as a prophet at all.
Right.
I'm seeing him as he's seen as a prophet by more people than I wish did see him as a prophet.
Is prophet an academic term that people use?
It can be, yeah. Yep. Yep. And another one here is a guy called Jack Miles, professor of English from the University of California.
California says it all.
What do you say?
Sorry,
Right.
California says
Oh, yes.
it all.
Well, maybe. He has a lot to say, though, on his own. And he's written just a massive thing, edited a massive study of religion. and in a much more playful tone. He recognizes what I call the Cheshire Cat problem of the image of God without the Creator, without God there. But he's much more casual and lighthearted about this. In sort of a playful tone, he writes, "Does anyone really believe that all men and women are created equal? But recognizing the delusional premise of American democracy needn't undermine faith in it." So what he's saying is, nobody really believes that all men and women are equal. But why should that demolish our faith in the equality of all people? It's an absolutely empty faith assertion that the faith is going to hang in midair with nothing underneath it. He says, why should we just let it be bothered by the fact that it's a delusion? It's good to believe. It sounds good. It's good to believe. There's an extraordinary confidence that he believes that it won't make any difference if America knows that it is a delusion. Equality is nice, comforting idea, but you don't need to really believe it's true. That's what he's saying. And I'd say that is so naive, because there's most places, an awful lot of the world doesn't believe it is true, never did believe it's true, and is not treating people nicely. And there's no leverage to improve that situation without the idea of equality as a lever, or as a fulcrum for the lever. Now let me look at our own history a little bit more. To believe in the equal dignity of all people, and to take that seriously at every level of life, is a very costly thing to do on any of us that believe it. If we really put it into practice, and we really let it work out in all the people we have a relationship to and meet, that is a very, very costly thing. It's not a fun little game to play, but it's a very deep commitment. If you believe it, it comes with obligations which demand to shape your life in every area. As you know, our country has not done very well on this, in living out these basic truths of the Declaration. Despite the fact that many of us have believed it to be true. Jefferson himself wrote it and believed it to be true, did not do very well with it. He who wrote it, he struggled deeply over the issue of slavery, but somehow did not have the courage or conviction or whatever he needed to free his 300 some odd slaves. Which would have meant the collapse of the beautiful lifestyle and estate in Monticello. He would have had to put it up for sale or whatever, would have collapsed. But he can write this and still possess 300 slaves, as could many other people as well. And I don't want to get into the whole thing of the Native American population that was treated with incredible callousness in the last century, two centuries ago rather. When we think of slavery and what has followed it through the Civil War and all the way down to today's race relations, it would be easy to see the beginning here in the Declaration as an exercise in massive hypocrisy at a national level. Martin Luther King Jr. knew all about racial hypocrisy, more than any of us will know, but he saw the claims, all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, not as an evidence of hypocrisy, but as an uncashed check, as a promissory note to African American people. He chose to see it first as an uncashed check. His call was not to scorn it, but to spend his life trying to achieve it for the first time, because it had never really been in practice. He gave his life to try and get this check to the bank, and did quite a lot, really, in doing just that. But notice, really important here, he did not believe that being created equal was a delusional premise of American democracy. He did not believe that this idea of equality was just a fabric of the imagination. He passionately believed it and was able to lead a lot of other people to passionately believe it. He believed that this is really true. This was not a collective fiction. This was really true, and he managed to swing the history of our whole country. by turning to Scripture, by turning to Jesus, by turning to the whole thing of the role of the church in it. Think of how the biblical prophets evaluated a nation. It was not by looking at how well a nation treated the rich and the powerful. It was this was not because the rich and powerful weren't as important to God as the poor. It was because the rich and powerful tend to be better connected with ways they can protect themselves, and they can get back at you if you treat them like dirt, and you don't need to worry about them so much. Whereas the poor don't have the resources. In order to determine whether a society honored God or not, the prophets looked at how they treated the poor and the powerless, the widow, the orphan, the fatherless, the sojourner, or refugee. The question for the prophets, does a society respect the command of God and recognize the value and dignity of those who are marginalized, those who are powerless, as equally made in God's likeness? And so to step in and help them have more of an equal opportunity at life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Think of Jesus' parallel teaching about how we deal with the least of these. He says, that's how you deal with me. You don't like that, you don't realize that, but that's true. How you deal with the least of the person you can see around in your space is how you're dealing with me, Jesus. And that's a heavy, heavy, heavy load to take seriously. And that's why we need a Savior, because none of us can live it out properly. Think of the Apostle James, who has scorching exposure of people in the church to which he's writing, who take upscale members of the church with gold rings and fancy clothes, and they're given special seats. And when poor people come to church with dirty clothes and probably who don't smell very good, they're told, sit at my feet. And James reacted with horror that they had acted with favoritism and made distinctions with evil thoughts. These sins were sins against the equal dignity of the diverse members of the body of Christ. James had to question the core of their faith itself. He's basically doubting, are you Christians at all? Do you, with your acts of favoritism, really believe in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ? Do you believe in Christ at all when you do this? Is what James is asking. He wants you to question whether your very salvation, are you a follower of Christ at all? And what's so terrifying is things like this can work into a society. An example on this verse is one wonderful Puritan commentator on the Bible called Matthew Henry. Some of you probably read his commentaries. He looks at this passage in his commentary, which I love. It's very, very helpful. And he says this with this idea of special seats for the richer people. Of course, this has nothing to do with our present practice of the Lord of the Manor having his pew in the front of the church and his servants sitting in the gallery. And I said, what? What does it have to do with it? It's exactly what, except it's built into the architecture of the church. The front pew has got the Lord of the Manor's name on it in brass, and no one's allowed to sit there. And here's in a Protestant Reformed church which is doing all sorts of things right, and looks at this because it so jars against the cultural assumptions that it doesn't connect. It doesn't connect. But you think maybe he did a little bit because he wouldn't have even bothered to mention it. Of course, it doesn't. To deny that that's what we do. Anyway, this is to do with James's. This kind of thing is. This we need to look and read the Bible creatively. That's one of the reasons we've been going to an African American church for the last 25 years and hearing the Bible preached by someone who's coming at it from a somewhat different culture. He sees stuff that you didn't see. His culture is different enough from yours, and so it's bingo, and it stops you short. So our struggle now, I think, is a really important struggle and a really hard one. It's really hard. What I've tried to say, it's really hard for us who do believe in the equality of all people. It's really hard for us to put them into practice. A line from James Baldwin. It is easy to proclaim all souls equal in the sight of God. It is hard to make men equal on earth in the sight of men. see, it's easy to say the Declaration, and put it back up here for us. And yet, how far do we fall short of it? Put simply, it's because of our selfishness, complacency, vanity. Most of us don't do very well despite our noble convictions. But, and this is something of a warning, what can we expect for an American future if many of our neighbors and friends increasingly do see this as a delusion and a fiction? In other words, no longer believe, as Jack Miles doesn't, and whatever, begin to see this as something we can't possibly believe in it because it's connected to God and we don't believe in God. Jack Miles doesn't think it matters if the premises of our democracy are delusions. I'm not at all so sure. I fear that democracy carries much more weight in modern American mind than the idea alone deserves. The word democracy is nowhere near as powerful a word as people think. Democracy is a very simple mathematical arrangement of political players, so that 51% of them wins a vote and 49% of them loses a vote. Democracy carries no moral weight or leverage within itself at all. Along with the wonderful credits of democracy that we would look to in world history, come the fact that it was Athenian democracy that voted to execute Socrates. It was German democracy and a democratic vote that elected Hitler in 1933. Hitler was elected by a democratic vote. The Arab Spring produced democratic votes for Sharia law, which meant to end democracy. A democratic vote to end democracy, because they voted in Sharia law, and that has no room for democracy. So what I'm saying is democracy itself alone is amoral. It doesn't settle anything. What makes the difference between democracy as a path toward justice and peace and democracy as a moral catastrophe is exactly the premises that you bring to democracy, that the people doing it, what premises do they bring to this whole process? From outside of democracy itself. What makes the difference are the ideas, commitments, practices brought to democracy from the minds, hearts, and passions and convictions of the people doing it, about justice, about God, about human nature, about human rights, about human dignity, human equality, human freedom. It's the passionate commitments to these things brought to democracy that can create something that will really stand and be worth encouraging it to stand. Otherwise, and will determine what will be voted in, what will be voted out, and how long the democracy itself is meant to last, is going to last. But human equality and basic rights are, I believe, are not delusions at all. They are true. I can and do believe in the intrinsic dignity of all people and their equality, but only because I believe there is a personal God there who has made us all in his image with equal dignity and worth. I also believe in the present time, those of us who do believe this, and our churches need to do a great deal better than we have at living it out on the ground, in the street, than we have done. Think of the voices in our daily news which shout out human vulnerability and desperation, that are voices that the prophets would have heard in their time. I'm not sure whether Christians hear them, or enough Christians hear them. Think of the issues that are around today that touch on this, that touch on the relevance of human equality and dignity, the nature and status of human beings, issues of race, of poverty, of health care, of education, of immigration, of refugees, of human enhancement, of eugenics, of the unborn and the end of life, and all the life in between. All these issues are issues where this question is at stake, the equal dignity of every human being. So my prayer is twofold, and I'll end with this. Two kinds of prayers. First of all, those who don't believe in the God of the Bible would feel the Cheshire Cat problem, would feel the tension between the wonderful ideals of liberal democracy that they espouse to, that commit them to the equality of all people and equal rights for all people, the tension between that and the total absence of grounding for that, the contradiction between that and a meaningless world. So he was talking, if the world is meaningless, there's no way we can put a foundation underneath those assertions. So my prayer is that more people would feel that tension and their own lack, that their own view of the world is not deep enough to support their own moral and political convictions. That's a better way of putting it. They would see that their own view of the world isn't deep enough to support their own political convictions about human dignity and equality, on which the U.S. was built, on which most of us, our hopes last. I have talked to a number of people who are not Christians who try to put this up. Quite a few people take it seriously. Some don't. And I'll give you what our neighbor says, because it's something of a challenge. He says, yes, I can see that, but why is it that evangelical Christians, of all people in America, seem to pay less attention than anybody else? Now, you can say he's wrong, but that's a perception that makes him very happy to turn his back on evangelical Christianity and go away. The perception of us as evangelical Christians is that we're not weighing in on this issue where it's at stake in the world today. Now, you can do what you want with the truth of that, or the falseness of that, but that's there, especially in the two coasts, especially in a blue state like our own. That's all around us, and if we want to communicate with those who are not Christians and have them take us seriously, we've got to somehow deal with stuff like that. So that's my first prayer. The second part is really a fulfillment of what I just ended here. In the early church, the followers of Christ managed to speak and live in such a way that a personal God, which would have been incomprehensible to the people they were living with, became comprehensible by watching them live, by seeing them, by listening to them, by watching them live, especially watching them care for the poor, watching them care for the sick. Christians invented the first hospitals were from the Roman army. But the Roman army treated only soldiers who they thought could get back in action. And they wouldn't bother with soldiers who were not rehabilitatable. Christians started hospitals for anybody, not just other Christians, but pagans. Everybody, anybody is welcome here. So that some of the later persecutions of Christians, there was very little popular support among the people of the empire in many places to support the emperor's decree that Christians should be persecuted. Because Christians have been helping. Christians have been opening their doors and helping heal people and moving forward. That's something we need. That's not the perception of us in the world today. That's something that's an amazing and something to me to aspire to be perceived in a way that would challenge people's unbelief in God at all, and bring them to be salt and light in God's world, and they come to believe and honor God who made us. I will end there. We're going to give a bit of break before Marty comes. Okay. I'll leave you.